Our next speaker is a person I like to call friend. Lee Leachman is originally from Billings, Montana. He now resides in northern Colorado near the Wyoming line in the town of Wellington. I've known Lee about 35 years. We've served together in leadership with the Beef Improvement Federation. We've worked together a lot in the cattle business. He and his wife Lisa and their son Graham and their daughter-in-law Jen are a blessed family. Christian believers who do some counseling with young couples. And I appreciate that, Lee, for what you stand for and who you are. I'm also working with Lee in a program called Dollar Profit. Dollar Profit is a database that he helped design to calculate across breed comparisons, EPDs of a sort, if you will, and selection indexes to best identify cattle that increase your bottom line the most. Not just increasing income, but reducing cost. Now, so we say, well, how in the world could a cowboy from Montana/Colorado develop something like this? Well, I want you to know he's one of the smartest people I know. He earned a honors degree, a master's of business administration from Harvard University. Studied some at Colorado State University as well. He currently also owns Rocky Mountain Sire Service, a semen collection company near Denver. Has sales around the country and sells 2,000 bulls per year. That's Red Angus, Angus, Stabilizer Composite, and Charolais bulls. So it is an honor to have, I'm tickled to have Lee Leachman to come and share some thoughts with you, a little bit of a new approach to genetic evaluation and selecting for profit. With that, please welcome my friend, Lee Leachman.
Thanks, Donald. Great to be here today. It was great to hear that rain on the roof. I know it's very little, right? It's not quite enough. Now, they just told me that my slides aren't going to work, okay? Now, I had this tremendous slideshow with movies and interactive, and, I mean, it was going to be wild, Donald. I never made one that good, you know. Let's try it? Okay, well, we'll try it. Oh, there's one, sort of, yes. Can you make it bigger? Maybe. He's going to try to fix it. Anyway, we're going to be fine either way, and we're going to catch up on the schedule. So those of you that didn't take the advantage to go to the bathroom break, I'm not going to speak for 2 hours. It'll only be an hour and 45 minutes, okay? So just bite your tongue, right? It'll be okay. But we are going to talk about some fun things. And I always like to start out and just give a little background. I really appreciate my friend Donald giving a great introduction on kind of where we are and what our family's into, and just loved coming in the door this morning for the prayer, and what a great prayer this morning. And we are really blessed to be in the industry we're in. I think it resonates to us as we heard the Producer of the Year award about our families on the land, and just the great joy we take from tending to God's creation. And certainly that's what we're all about, and we're just trying to help ranchers do it better. And I think we have tools today. I mean, let's face it, like most of you didn't get into ranching because you love analyzing data and you want to use sophisticated computer programs to design genetics that are going to increase the feed efficiency and reproductive success of your cattle, right? That would be like somebody's PhD document, right? But the truth is that technology is available to us today. And just like it's changed how we grow crops, and we heard from a great presentation this morning about the challenge to increase the productivity of our crops, and now we're going to face the same thing with our cattle, and we have to utilize this technology. I mean, precision planting and precision management of agriculture, as most of you know around here, has been so critical to increasing yields and holds tons of potential. And that same precision approach is now available to us in cattle, and we're just starting to take advantage of that. And that's what the presentation is going to be about. I'm going to talk about some things we're doing in our operation, how we're approaching selection, not to say that you need to do what we're doing, but to give you some ideas about what the potential is on ways to look at traditional decisions you've been making about genetics in a little different way. And I think a way that could give you some more advantages. And so that's what the talk's going to be about. And we'll see, let's see, if we click the next, will it go to the next one? I'm going to keep rolling, and when it catches up, just let me know, Donald. So just a little bit of background on our family. My grandfather started out in the business in the 1930s. They started an Angus operation called Ankeny Angus in upstate New York, and they selected cattle on visual appraisal. And if you were around in the industry back in those days, you know that cattle were selected to be quite a bit smaller, and that was kind of the thing. And it wasn't really based on any great information as to why that was a better answer, but we thought that was a better answer, and so we made them that way. And my dad kind of oversaw the change in type that happened in the early 70s. He moved out to Billings, Montana, and started an operation there. That's where I grew up, in Montana. And we were, yeah, Ed, I'll give that back to you. And we got into performance testing and measuring animals and selecting for growth. And the first EPDs, you see these things, right? These numbers in these bull sale catalogs started showing up in the early 1980s. They'd been used in crop production and other species clear back into the 50s, but we really got them into beef cattle in the 1980s, and that allowed us to identify the animals that grew the fastest. And from the early 80s through really the mid and late 90s, we were selecting for growth rate and cattle that grew faster and got bigger, because we all knew that if we could sell more pounds, we'd make more money. That was the bottom line. That was the approach. And it was really interesting. We started weighing our cows in the late 1980s. That was a very kind of strange thing to be doing in the 80s, because people weren't doing that. But we said, you know, we're going to weigh these cows. And I can remember one day, my dad used to advertise a lot. If you see my dad, he was a big promoter, and he would promote that our cows weighed 1,250 pounds back when everybody's cows weighed 1,000. And then he promoted that they weighed 1,300 pounds. And then one year, he called me and he said, we got a problem. I said, what's the problem? He said, I just weighed the cows, and they weighed 1,400 pounds, and we can't say that because nobody wants a 1,400-pound cow. Now, this was in 1986. Okay? So it's a long time ago, right? Now, today, if I say 1,400 pounds, nobody even bats an eye, right? Because we all know in every herd in the room, there's 1,400-pound cows. There's cows plenty bigger than that, right? So there's lots of big cows today. But my dad realized, he said, I don't know how big we want to make these cows. He said, we got to stop selecting just for growth. And now let's think about that. That was 34 years ago. That's about when we met, Donald Brown, right? And so this whole idea of what we select for, and I guess I got into the business. I'm probably the weird nut in the room, because I got into it because I love that data, okay? I loved analyzing that data. I love looking at that data. I love trying to figure out what we were going to select for. So I got out of college in the late 80s, came into the family business. That was about the time we said we can't select upward on cow size anymore. So we started measuring other things. We started doing ultrasound and selecting for carcass merit and improving that side of the animal, right? We said we want to make an animal that marbles more and has bigger ribeye. We were fortunate in the early 90s to own an Angus bull named Bonview New Design 1407, and he was an outlier. He was a decade ahead of his time. He didn't do everything right, but he was a bull that made more marbling and more ribeye at the same time. And so it was just an interesting bull. And we made progress at that stage. And then we started measuring more things. In the early 2000s, that business actually came to an end. I was really sharp. I got us into a branded beef program. That's a whole nother presentation. It was a super, super educational moment in my life. It cost way more than going to Harvard, where I went to school, and I learned more from it. But we did go broke, and I ended up moving to Colorado in 2003 and starting over. And then it was a really interesting moment for a lot of reasons, and we could, again, have 3 or 4 different talks on that. But my partner at the time was a fellow by the name of Dallas Horton. And Dallas had a big ranching operation in central Wyoming. And we were sitting down, and we were going to get ready to have our bull sale. We're going to sell 500 bulls, and Dallas was going to buy 20 or 30 of them to put up on his commercial herd. And I can remember we sat down in the conference room, and he said, Lee, which bulls should I buy? Now, this guy owned feedlots and cow-calf operations. He'd done progeny tests. He'd done ranch-to-rail programs internally. He was a veterinarian. I mean, I said, Dallas, what do you want them? What do you want the bulls to do? I mean, you want them to make your cows bigger, or milkier, or grow faster, or better carcass, or whatever? And I just kept. He just shook his head. He said, no. He said, I just want to make more money. I said, we don't have a measurement for that. He said, that's really a problem, Lee. He said, if we can't tell which bulls are going to make more money, how am I going to pick the right bulls? And I said, well, Dallas, the good news is I know somebody who does that calculation, and there was a group out of Eastern Canada, kind of an obscure group, and they'd been doing this analysis. And if you remember, if you're in the seed stock business, this is about the same time that the Angus Association came out with an index called dollar beef, okay? So we were all starting to think that we got all these EPD numbers, right, that tell us how big the birth weight is, how big the weaning weight is, how much they grow, how much they milk, how big the carcass is, all this different stuff. But we started to actually calculate dollar indexes. Those first dollar indexes were all about more production, more output. This one that we went and looked not only at the output, but the cost side. It said, what are they going to eat? How many calves are they going to reproduce? How long are they going to stay in the herd? Some of these factors that drive our cost of production. Because those of us in the seed stocking business, and all of us are guilty of this, when we just had the numbers for growth, what are we going to select for? You want to buy the same number, or you want to buy a bigger number? Everybody wants a bigger number. So that became really easy. We'd raise bigger animals, and we promote the bigger number, and sure enough, the bull that sold the highest in the sale, usually the bull that had the biggest number. And so we were on a trend, right, up and up. And this index said, no, you need this mathematical equation. Really, it's more like a budget than anything else, because it was looking at the output and the cost side together, okay? And so how do you take that into account? And you know, it's funny, but at the time, we started running these analyses, and we started printing them, and we started selling bulls based on them. And of course, we liked the animals that had the higher indexes. And then a friend of mine, good friend of mine, who worked with us in the business, he was consulting a large commercial ranch in eastern Kansas. And he came to me, he said, look, we're measuring feed efficiency now. We're measuring carcass. We're measuring all these things. We got this index. We call it dollar profit. It makes these cattle more profitable. If we took the 20 best bulls on that index and put them out and bred these herds in this eastern Kansas, if we took your seed stock bulls that you're using in your herd, Lee, in the spring, and we put them out on this commercial herd in the fall, won't that make the feeder calves worth a heck of a lot more money? You know, it's like, well, that's the theory. Right? That's the theory. So we sent those 20 bulls to eastern Kansas, and they bred the cows, and we sent the calves to the feedlot. And we'd been sending calves from this feedlot. There was a feedlot at the time called Decatur County, and they were up in Decatur County, Kansas. Warren Weibert was the owner at the time. And this ranch had been feeding calves there for 3 or 4 years. And to be frank, the calves were pretty lackluster. When we compared them to the other calves fed at the feedlot, they ranked well below average. And we sent these calves out of these top bulls, and they moved from being well below average to being in the top 15%. And that was really a watershed event for us. We said, wow, here's this index. It's looking at this, and those cattle gained more, and they ate less. They converted better. Their cost to gain was lower. Their grid value was higher. All the different things moved the right way. And we said, wow, you know, this index that's looking at cost and revenue is working, at least on the terminal side of things. And that was a watershed event for us, and that was back in the early 2000s, 2009, 2010. And two things happened at that. First of all of our customers then started to pay more attention to the number. And second of all, we as breeders started to have more confidence in the number. And so it really changed our focus on how we select those animals. And then the big innovation, probably the biggest two innovations that came out of all that, one was, as seed stock producers, we tend to measure output, but we don't measure the input. And what's the biggest input in our cattle operations? It's feed, right? We might say it's labor, but when we take into account the cost of our grass, it's feed, okay? And unfortunately, as we selected animals that grew bigger and faster, You know, animals that are more like Andy and I than like Donald, right? You know, we're bigger in frame and heavier. It turns out that we ate more. We just weren't efficient, okay? We actually ate more to get it. I know you didn't, Andy. I probably did, but the same thing was happening in our cattle. We're making cattle that eat more, okay? How significant is it? Well, this is just, I always think that there are just little switches that go off in your mind that trigger things to help you remember. We all are familiar with dairy cattle, right? We see dairy cattle, they milk a lot. We know they eat a lot, right? They eat a lot because they're milking a lot. They're selected to eat a lot. Do you know if you put those dairy cross animals in the feedlot alongside beef animals, they eat less per day than our beef animals? We've selected beef animals to eat so much, to grow so fast. And in many cases, when you select and you don't measure, you go past the optimum, okay? It's like if you were putting fertilizer on and not measuring the cost, okay? You'd put too much fertilizer on. But, of course, we do measure the cost because it's pretty obvious to us. Only in this feed in our cattle, we don't see it because most of it's grazed. And so we've made animals that grow faster, that weigh more at a given age, that reach market weight sooner and maybe even heavier, but they use a lot of feed in getting there. And unfortunately, those traits of growth and carcass are antagonistic to a lot of the maternal traits we measure. We'll just take just a 2-second break here.
We're going to try. Those slides are really good, and so we're going to try to get that pulled up so that he can do that. And but I want you to be thinking about what questions you have as he challenges us relative to cow size. How many of you would say your cows have gotten bigger in the last 10 years? Can I see a show of hands? I think most of us in the room would say, and especially if we put them on the scale. Somebody said, you know how to accurately measure a cowman's cows? You ask him how much they weigh and add 200. You know, when we take them to the sale and we get that check going, man, that's a lot heavier than I thought they were going to be. You know, that 1,000-pound cow's like a mythical creature now. But I will tell you that using Lee's program, this dollar profit program, over the last decade has reduced the cow herd size in our herd by 100 pounds, while keeping growth where it is and increasing marbling significantly. And the feed efficiency deal, looking at the cost side of the equation, is something we haven't done a lot of. You know, we've looked at more weaning weight and more calves with better calving ease and more growth through pounds of milk production in the cow and more ribeye and more marbling and more. But with that more comes more cost. And so I really like this approach of analyzing a cost-benefit analysis of, all right, is that extra growth worth the cost that it's costing us in feeding the cow throughout her entire lifetime? And as we look at sustainability, and as I look at James Henderson and Mary Lou Henderson back here, they were the first winners of the Sustainability Award at American Angus. And I love their definition of sustainability, and it's simply doing more with less. And so, Lee, are we getting close to getting that maybe up and going?
They said I was doing fine without them. I'm gonna keep going until
you charge on, baby.
They get them. They're in the internet somewhere. they're in the internet of everything somewhere, and they'll arrive at some point. And then when they do, you'll be all like, oh, look at that, right? And until then, we'll just keep talking. So we were on this discussion about selection for growth and carcass. And it shouldn't really surprise us that made feed intake go up. But it had another consequence, which was probably even worse. And what do we think that consequence is? This is the group participation. This is the push you back to see if you were listening. So if you're selecting for growth and carcass, what set of traits likely goes the wrong way? Pardon me? Reproduction, yeah, or maternal, or whatever we want to call that, right? The whole aspect of the cow and what we want the cow to do on the ranch, right? We want that cow to come into the herd. We want her to breed early. We want her to breed back at a high percentage. We want her to calve unassisted. We want her to have good calves. We want her to stay in body condition. We want her to stay in the herd for a long time. And what we probably, we knew, I mean, Donald and I were trained, and many of you were trained to know that when we selected for these growth and output traits, it did bother reproduction, and we knew that reproduction was worth a lot more to us on our cow-calf operation than was that growth, okay? But we all succumbed to the temptation to select for the bigger cattle. I mean, there's probably people in the room who don't have 1,400-pound cows, but I bet they would be in the minority today, okay? Because the reality is most cattle today are that big, okay, if not bigger. Most cattle in seed stock herds are even bigger than that. Very few of us had the discipline to regulate that size, and as a consequence, as we look at the database today and look at that reproductive maternal function, most of the cutting-edge genetics that are available today do not excel relative to the genetics we had historically on that reproductive trait, okay? They do on growth and carcass. They do grow faster. They do make more prime, but they don't on fertility. And so we have a challenge on how we measure that. So we started a partnership, and Donald referred to it as his dollar profit share partnership. It involves about 35 breeders all over the world, and they're pouring data into our system. And about 5 years ago, we made a deal with Zoetis to do a genomic analysis of this database. And they started working on it. And all that did was, like any genomics, it made our predictions more accurate. But probably most interesting out of that relationship with Zoetis is they came to us about 2.5 years ago and said, we have an EPD that we want you to look at that we think is the best prediction of cow fertility. And so they showed it to us, and I shared it with Donald. I shared it with all the other 35 breeders, and we all looked at it, and we didn't know much what to make sense out of it, did we, Donald? We're like, well, it looks like the bulls that are high on that are bulls that we think are probably good reproduction, good fertility bulls. But if you're in my mindset, I want to turn that into that budget, right? I want to put that in there so I can analyze all those traits at once. And so I actually came down to Texas and went to Texas A&M Kingsville, and I handed them this fertility EPD, and I said, this EPD predicts how many calves a bull's daughter is going to have, okay? So when I have an EPD on one bull be +3, an EPD on another bull +2. And I said, what's that mean? That means the 3, his daughters are going to have one more calf. And all of us, we're like, well, I don't know what that means. I mean, like maybe the average daughter has 6 calves, and so one more is a 7th calf. So what's a 7th calf work? How do we figure that out? So, you know, I love Dr. Clay Mathis gives great talks. He'd be a good guy to speak in the future. He's been here, yeah. And so I called Clay, and I said, Clay, we got this EPD. It predicts how many calves. We need to turn that into money, and we don't know how to do that. He said, I'll put a couple of our people on it, and they'll analyze it and come back to you in a few months. And so they did. And 2 interesting things came out of that. The first one was, it turns out that bulls that have daughters that leave more calves in the database, those daughters have higher conception rates. That's how they get more calves, right? Because we cull open cows. Okay, we cull problem cows. Cows that don't leave a lot of calves, they got culled out of the herd. They effectively had a lower reproductive rate. So that was a big aha. The second aha was, what's that worth? Now, we've always learned that that's worth a ton of money, okay? Why is it worth a ton of money? Well, you got about the same cost structure you have regardless whether you wean 100% calf crop or a 50% calf crop. You're going to spend about the same amount of money, okay? So the marginal increase, the slight increase in fertility creates more revenue. That's the first effect. That all makes sense to us, right? If we got 2 more calves to sell out of 100, that's going to put more money in our pocket, right? And in the next 12 months, that might put a couple $1,000 more in our pocket, okay? Just by a 2% change. The other factor, though, is the big hidden cost in cow-calf production, which is the cost of replacing the cow with a heifer, right? That's a big cost. And any way we look at that, that looks like it's $900 to $1,000. So we take the cost of taking that heifer calf, rearing her up, getting her bred, putting her into production, and then we subtract from that the salvage value of the cow she replaced, and we're left with this $900 depreciation figure, right? Now, not unless your accountant prepares your book so you don't see that number. If they do, they can tell you exactly what that number is. If you have more calves, the depreciation cost per calf goes way down. What's the depreciation cost per calf on a first calf heifer that weans that first calf and comes up open? What would it be? You're going to divide that $900 by how many? By 1. So we got a $900 depreciation charge against 1 calf. That heifer make you money? No. No. And where are most of our opens? They're in those 2s and 3s. And it turns out that there are bulls in our database that make a whole bunch of daughters that do that. Produce 1 or 2 and then fall out of bed. And there are other bulls where that rebreeding rate early in life is very high, and then they have a much higher probability of having more calves. And that is the single most economically important trait today, and it's called fertility, cow fertility. That trait is the #1 driver of economics. We put that into our model. It was kind of like, if you're in the seed stock business, kind of like an earthquake when what you were selecting for changes, because some of the bulls you really loved weren't good at that number. And now the model says they're not profitable. The low fertility ones are not profitable. The high fertility ones are profitable. So to me, we're at a new stage, because now we're characterizing what I think is almost the whole function of cow profitability, right? We're looking at the fertility and the maternal side of it. We're looking at the growth, production, and carcass, and we have the feed intake, okay? And all of that's genomically driven. So we have a much higher accuracy on that. And the best thing, probably the coolest thing about our relationship with Zoetis is now you can do a DNA test on your commercial heifers that give you predictions on those heifers on all those traits, including indexes that tell you how to balance that. And when we do that analysis on commercial herds, the results are nothing short of shocking, okay? Because what that will show is within your herd, looking at your best heifers versus your worst heifers on their likely cost and output per year, there's differences of over $100 per heifer. Your best heifers will make you $150, $200 more a year than your worst heifers. And if you retain them through all the way through harvest, the differences get even bigger. And so now we're able to look at that, at our selection a little bit differently and say, we don't want more output. We don't want the bigger growth number. We want the higher profit number. And that profit for us is either going to be defined as profit in our cow-calf sector, and we call that dollar ranch. We're just selecting from birth through weaning. We're selling the calves at weaning. Or we select from birth to harvest, and we're selling that animal on the rail, okay? Those have different traits. And so what are we trying to find? The needles in the haystack, right? We're trying to find the rare animals that do the maternal function the way we want, that give us increased fertility, but then also give us output and carcass traits that drive the boat. And we can do that today. And the amazing thing is, and this is not surprising, in every one of your herds, when you go home today, think about those cows that have made it through the gauntlet for 8 or 9 or 10 or 12 years, right? We all know if we could propagate more cows like that, we would make more money. The trouble is, by the time we find them, first of all, we probably don't know who their sire was, and haven't had a way to duplicate them. We go buy a young bull and we hope that he's going to produce what we want, but now we have genomics that can look back at that database and say, here's a bull that's more likely to propagate that kind of cow. Here's a bull that's more likely to propagate a cow that's the right size, that's high on fertility, that's going to require less feed to stay pregnant and in the herd. And maybe that bull also has some real positive traits on through the feedlot if we find the needles in the haystack. And so for me, 30-some years into selection of beef cattle, this is the most exciting time we've ever been in. Not because Troy told us prices are going to be high. Look, I'm as excited as anybody about that, right? Everybody says, what's the best strategy right now? The best strategy right now is to own more cattle. Okay, that's the best strategy right now. And if we listen to the second presentation, on top of that, the second best strategy is to use hedging vehicles to protect ourselves because it's going to be volatile. Okay, so you can summarize those two talks. Prices are going up. Owning more cattle is a good idea. It's going to be volatile. We should hedge. We got great tools to hedge now. I'm not going to do a hedging commercial, but we use those tools. We use LRP. We believe that's a great tool. And now the third piece of that is we have these DNA-powered tools to make your selection of which replacement heifers you're going to keep. Maybe if it rains well, maybe you're going to keep them all, okay? If you're going to keep them all, don't DNA test them because DNA is not going to tell you anything. The reason a DNA test, you say, I got 100, I'm only going to keep 50, and I want to keep the 50 best ones. Test them, pick the best ones. In the next 5 years, if you do that year after year, it will have an enormous impact on the quality and profitability of your cow herd. And that's a totally new thing, right? That's not something we've really had at our disposal, particularly looking at all those different traits. And now we can, and we can look at it in simplified indexes that predict our bottom line. So that's the takeaway from my talk is we have tools to actually select the animals that are going to drive more profit, measuring all the traits that we know are important. We've had tools before, but maybe we didn't look at all the traits, right? If we had tools that just looked at growth and carcass, we probably messed up the cow. And a lot of us are in that boat, but now you can change that direction. And I just encourage you, if you want to learn more about these tools, talk to these seed stock producers that are using it, like R.A. Brown Ranch, talk to your local Zoetis rep, and they can talk to you about what's called an inherit test. This inherit test on your replacement heifers will allow you to sort them on profitability. I can tell you in my herd, and Donald's herd, and the 30-some other herds that utilize these tools, we will not make a selection decision unless we know what these predictions are on our animals. We will not decide to keep a replacement. We will certainly not decide to put a bull into our herd unless we have this information. And that same tool is available to you to sort your replacement heifers. And it's one of the biggest innovations we've ever had. Where is this going? Okay, let's just take 2 seconds and crystal ball, and then I think I got us close back on time right now. The crystal ball of this is today, if you don't retain ownership, you're going to sell your calves somewhere, somehow. Superior gives you a great avenue for doing it, for marketing them. But when you sell on Superior, unless the feedlot fed them last year, do they know what they're really going to do? Do they know what they're really going to do? So you got all these people out there bidding. What do you try to explain it to them? You say, I used Brown's bulls or Leachman's bulls or someone else's bulls. They're NHTC. We got all these stamps, right? All the things we do. But how are they going to gain and convert, and how are they going to marble, and how big are they going to get on carcass weight? We don't know all that stuff. The technology exists today. That same DNA test you do will tell the feedlot exactly how those calves are going to perform in the feedlot. So we're going through an information revolution on animals, okay? With the ability to individually identify, with individual DNA tests, we're going to see feedlots adopt precision management of those cattle. and I'm going to tell you that 10 years from now, DNA and how your cattle score on DNA is going to drive a significant amount of the value of your feeder calf. Okay? I'm further going to tell you, if you're doing all this and testing your heifers, you're going to keep them and feed them. Because nobody is going to know them as well as you do, and you'll have made them better enough that you have a guaranteed profitability, even if you hedge them, by feeding them. And so these are game-changing technologies. It's going to change how you select. It's going to change how you market. It's going to change how you manage. And it's driven by big data and DNA and information systems. And so I think it's a great time to figure out how to use them. It's a great time to invest in that technology because we're going to have the profitability over the next few years to do that. Take a little bit of that money and put it back into making sure that your cow herd becomes the best possible cow herd. So that's the end of the presentation, and I'm happy to take Q&A if you guys want to do that. We're moving the mic to them, right, Andy? Okay. Any questions?
Got one right here.
Yes. So there's multiple tests out there. We're affiliated with Zoetis. Zoetis, pardon me? Oh, sorry, I'll repeat the question. Thank you. The question was, is that DNA test that I've been talking about, is that through Zoetis? And the answer is yes. Zoetis has a DNA test for commercial heifers. It's called Inherit, like you inherit the genes, okay? Inherit is the test we've been talking about, and through that Inherit test, you can get these EPDs and values on your commercial heifers. Great question. Can you do that for your bulls? Come talk to Donald and I. Because we made a deal with Zoetis, right? And we really want to make we have to keep selling bulls. So we don't want to lose our bull market, but you can do it for bulls. But to do it for bulls, you got to contribute data to the database. Okay? As an example, in that database today, we got 45,000 animals where we've measured individual feed efficiency. Hundreds or thousands of them at R.A. Brown Ranch, hundreds or thousands of them at our place, and from all these different breeders. So these breeders are investing literally $70, $80, $100 to get a feed efficiency record that tells us how much that animal eats in these bunks. And we put that in a database. And then you get that prediction on your commercial heifers. If you want to run that on bulls, come see us. You have to contribute to that database. That's kind of it's really the contract that we have, so to speak, with Zoetis. Yeah. Both had the same question.
So I've said, and I mean it, Lee, I think Lee's one of the geniuses in genomics that we have in the beef cattle business. So I want to ask you for a show of hands. Lee, I apologize we didn't have the PowerPoint for you. If you'd like to hear more from Mr. Leachman, and maybe us having back next year to the conference to get deeper in what he's talking about, raise your hand. Now look at there, Lee.
You're a good salesman, Andy. See, now, I think Andy just asked me if I'd come back, and I just said yes, I think. So that was well done. But, hey, thank you all, and what a great conference and great information. So thank you for the chance to be here.
So, don't leave. I got to give you this. So I want to thank Lee. He's a busy guy. How many bulls have you sold this fall or this spring? Only 1,000. 1,000 bulls. The other day I called him. He said, could I call you back? We've just finished selling 500 or 600 bulls in a sale. He said, I'll call you back in a day or two. This guy's about as busy a fella as you know. And Lee, it's a real privilege to have you here in the Panhandle, to have you at our Beef Cattle Conference. We have utmost respect for you and what you do for the industry. So help me recognize Mr. Lee Leachman one more time. Thanks, Lee. Are you going to be able to skip